18 years ago, an 11-year-old girl in Meyers, California disappeared while walking to her school bus stop just a few dozen meters from her front door. She was taken in plain sight of her stepfather, leaving her family devastated and the entire South Lake Tahoe community shaken to its core. Law enforcement searched extensively but failed to uncover any reliable leads pointing toward the kidnapper, while the perpetrator, a sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape, kept Jaycee concealed in his backyard. He was never found despite his parole officer visiting his home 60 times over the years that followed. Through all of it, however, Jaycee's mother never stopped believing her daughter was still alive somewhere. She had no way of knowing that Jaycee had been living just 120 miles away from her for the entire 18 years. Then in 2009, two campus officers at UC Berkeley noticed what 60 official parole checks had failed to see, and what they uncovered left everyone connected to the case completely stunned. In the summer of 1991, America was riding a wave of optimism following the Gulf War, with soldiers returning home, Nirvana's Nevermind transforming popular music, and television screens showing the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the year the Cold War officially came to an end. Americans felt more secure than they had in a long time. In Meyers, California, a community of roughly 5,000 people perched at 6,200 feet in the Sierra Nevada mountains, 5 miles southwest of South Lake Tahoe, ponderosa pine forests blanketed the hillsides, neighbors knew each other by name, and children rode their bicycles freely without anyone giving it a second thought. The Probyn family lived in that peaceful neighborhood. Terry Probyn was Jaycee's mother and Carl Probyn was her stepfather. Jaycee Lee Dugard was 11 years old, a girl with blonde hair and a bright smile who was remembered by everyone who knew her as cheerful, innocent, and full of laughter. On the morning of June 10, 1991, with the school year drawing to a close and summer just around the corner, Carl Probyn dropped Jaycee off at the school bus stop a few dozen meters from their front door, then returned to the yard to get on with his morning tasks. A few minutes later, a gray sedan pulled up alongside her. Philip Garrido, 40 years old and a resident of Anch, California, 190 miles to the west, stepped out of the car, used a stun gun on the 11-year-old girl standing at the stop, and forced her into the vehicle. Nancy Garrido was sitting behind the wheel. The entire abduction was over in seconds. Carl Probyn, still in the yard, caught a glimpse of the gray car stopping, the man stepping out, and his daughter being pushed inside before he could fully comprehend what he was witnessing. He grabbed his bicycle and gave chase, but the car was gone before he could get anywhere near it. He stood staring at the empty stretch of road where it had vanished, then ran inside to call 911. Several other witnesses had observed fragments of the abduction, but nobody had managed to get a license plate number, and none of them had captured enough detail to give investigators anything workable. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, the state of California, and the FBI launched an immediate and large-scale response. The search for Jaycee Dugard that began on June 10, 1991 rapidly grew into one of the most extensive searches in El Dorado County history. Thousands of volunteers from across the South Lake Tahoe region, search and rescue dogs, helicopters, and the FBI's Sacramento field office all threw their resources into the effort. Thousands of tips and reported sightings flooded in from across California and Nevada. Every single one was followed up. Every lead was pursued. None of them led to Jaycee. Carl Probyn gave investigators a description of the gray sedan and the man who had used the stun gun, but without a license plate number and without any specific distinguishing characteristics to narrow down suspects in a state with millions of gray vehicles, the investigation had very little traction. Search efforts remained concentrated on the South Lake Tahoe area and the neighboring state of Nevada. They never extended toward the Bay Area. They never reached Contra Costa County or the city of Anch in the East Bay, 190 miles west of Meyers, where Philip Garrido was living and where Jaycee was being held captive. The case stalled within the first few weeks and grew steadily colder as the years passed. While El Dorado County investigators and the FBI continued searching for Jaycee in the South Lake Tahoe region, Philip Craig Garrido was living an outwardly unremarkable life in Anch, a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape, with a criminal history in the American justice system far more serious than that of any suspect the South Lake Tahoe investigation had ever seriously considered. In 1976, Garrido had abducted a woman named Catherine Callaway Hall in Nevada, bound her, confined her in a shed, and subjected her to hours of sexual assault before being arrested and sentenced to 50 years in federal prison along with a life sentence in state court. It was a sentence designed to permanently remove him from society. He was released after just 11 years, in 1988, only 3 years before he took Jaycee Dugard. During his parole period, his victim Catherine Callaway Hall had taken it upon herself to contact his parole agent directly, warning that Garrido was continuing to engage in dangerous behavior and needed more rigorous supervision. The system had received a warning from the one person who understood better than anyone how dangerous Garrido truly was. The system disregarded it entirely. The investigation into Jaycee's kidnapping never turned in Garrido's direction, not because no investigator thought to connect a registered sex offender with a documented history of kidnapping, living 190 miles away, to a gray car at a school bus stop in Meyers, but because the investigation simply never looked the right way. Jaycee Lee Dugard, the 11-year-old who had been standing at a bus stop in Meyers, California on that June morning, was taken to 1554 Walnut Avenue in Anch, California, a suburban property in the East Bay. The neighbors saw what looked like a regular family occupying the front of the house and had no reason to look beyond that. But behind the house, concealed behind dense trees, a high wooden fence, and tarps deliberately arranged to prevent any view from outside, Philip Garrido had constructed and steadily expanded over time a hidden compound of tents and sheds, the place where Jaycee would spend the next 18 years of her life. Garrido kept roughly 900 square feet of concealed space where Jaycee was held completely cut off from the outside world. During the early part of her captivity, she lived in near total isolation, unable to leave the property, with no one to interact with besides Philip and Nancy Garrido, no reliable electricity or running water, no schooling, and no access to medical care. Having just been taken from her mother, stepfather, and the Meyers community she'd grown up in at age 11, she was confined to a small, tightly controlled world entirely under Garrido's command. From the moment she was abducted at 11, Philip Garrido subjected her to repeated sexual assault, which continued for years while parole officials kept recording him as compliant with his release conditions. In 1994, at age 14, she gave birth to her first daughter, Garrido's child, inside the backyard compound, with no doctor, hospital, or medical assistance for either the teenage mother or the infant. In 1997, at 17, she had a second daughter under similarly unsupported conditions. Both girls grew up entirely within the compound, without schooling, birth certificates, or any legal documentation of their existence, and Garrido told outsiders the girls were his granddaughters. Becoming a mother reportedly transformed Jaycee's outlook. She was no longer focused solely on herself but on a child who depended on her, which gave her a reason to keep going and reportedly kept her from taking drastic, dangerous action. Garrido didn't rely purely on physical force to keep her there. Over 18 years, he constructed an elaborate system of psychological control built on total isolation, complete financial dependency, and extreme religious belief. He viewed himself as a prophet carrying out a divine mission, and this worldview shaped an enclosed reality within the compound that Jaycee and her daughters had no frame of reference outside of. In her memoir, A Stolen Life, Jaycee later wrote about the complex psychological process she went through during those years, about learning how to survive and protect her two daughters in a situation where there were no other choices, and about why escaping was not as simple as outsiders imagined. While the family remained confined at the Walnut Avenue property, with Garrido continuing to add tents and sheds to expand the enclosure, the federal parole system carried out its routine oversight. Between 1999 and 2009, parole officers visited Garrido's home 60 times over a decade, each time knocking, speaking with him at the front of the property, documenting his compliance, and leaving without ever entering the backyard where the compound stood, despite full property inspections being standard practice for supervising a sex offender, despite Garrido's prior history of kidnapping and holding a victim, and despite enough in his record to warrant more than a surface-level check. Jaycee and her daughters were living only a short distance away, separated from these officers by nothing more than a fence and some coverings. In 2006, after 15 years of her captivity, a neighbor alerted Anch police that people appeared to be living in tents in Garrido's backyard and that children's voices could be heard from the covered area, the kind of first-hand tip law enforcement is trained to act on. Officers went to the house, spoke with Garrido out front, again did not check the backyard, and closed the matter as a non-issue. Jaycee, her daughters, and a decade and a half of evidence sat just behind the gate the officers stood in front of before leaving. In 2008, parole officials launched their own inquiry into Garrido after receiving reports about odd behavior. Investigators visited, questioned him, and once more failed to inspect the backyard, leaving the compound, and the family inside it, undiscovered. It would take another year before 2 university police officers spotted what years of professional checks had missed, not through special equipment or legal authority, but through basic suspicion that something wasn't right. On August 24, 2009, Garrido visited the UC Berkeley campus with 2 teenage girls, his biological daughters with Jaycee, seeking a permit to hold a religious gathering for a group he called God's Desire. Jaycee herself wasn't present, she remained confined in Anch. He was first met by Lisa Campbell, the UCPD events office manager responsible for campus event permits, who immediately felt something was off. Garrido's intense, erratic manner of describing his religious mission, paired with the girl's withdrawn and submissive demeanor. Rather than confront him directly, Campbell scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next day and alerted UC Berkeley police officer Ally Jacobs. Jacobs ran a background check and found Garrido was a registered sex offender on federal parole dating back to a 1976 kidnapping and rape conviction, immediately raising serious concern, especially since his parole file showed no record of him having children, despite the two girls with him. On August 25, Jacobs and Campbell held a second meeting with Garrido in Campbell's office, deliberately keeping the interaction casual so he wouldn't suspect he was under investigation and potentially flee before parole authorities could intervene. During the meeting, he took out a self-published book he'd written about schizophrenia. Afterward, Jacobs reached out directly to parole officer Edward Santos Jr., briefing him on the two girls, Garrido's odd conduct, and everything observed over the previous 2 days. Recognizing this as significant information missing from Garrido's file, Santos immediately called him into the parole office in Concord and told him to bring everyone living with him. On August 26, 2009, Garrido showed up at the Concord office with Nancy Garrido, the two teenage girls, and a young woman he described as his niece, Alyssa. Investigators questioned each person separately. During his interrogation, Garrido eventually admitted to kidnapping and raping Jaycee Dugard back in 1991. The young woman known as Alyssa, who had spent 18 years living under that name in the tent compound behind the Anch house, confirmed who she really was. The girl who had been waiting for her school bus in Meyers, California on the morning of June 10, 1991, whose stepfather, Carl Probin, had unsuccessfully chased the kidnapper's car on his bike, was now a 29-year-old woman sitting in the Concord parole office, saying her true name aloud to authorities for the first time in 18 years. That night, Jaycee and her two daughters were brought by authorities to a safe location, away from both the Anch house and the compound that had defined their entire existence for nearly 2 decades. The FBI set up a phone call between Jaycee and her mother, Terry Probin, who was in Southern California, marking the first time in 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days that mother and daughter had heard each other's voices. The next morning, Terry flew north and was reunited in person with her daughter and the 2 granddaughters she never knew existed. Jaycee's aunt, Tina Dugard, who witnessed the reunion, told reporters that her sister's smile stretched as wide as the ocean now that her oldest daughter was finally home, describing a mix of laughter, tears, and simply being together, and noted that Jaycee remembered everyone in the family. One especially painful detail only came to light afterward. Throughout the entire 18 years, Jaycee had been held in Anch, less than 200 miles from her home in South Lake Tahoe, meaning that while Terry searched desperately across California and Nevada hoping her daughter was still alive somewhere, Jaycee had actually been under 2 hours away the whole time. Philip and Nancy Garrido were both arrested at the Concord parole office on August 26, 2009, following Philip's confession to his parole officer. They initially faced an extensive list of charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, multiple rape counts including rape connected to kidnapping, lewd acts with a child under 14, and numerous other charges tied to the 18-year ordeal, and both entered not guilty pleas at first. The case dragged on for close to 2 years, marked by repeated hearings and delays, with growing pressure from the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office to reach a resolution that would spare Jaycee and her daughters from testifying. In April 2011, Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 kidnapping count and 13 counts of sexual assault, including 6 rape charges and 7 lewd act charges. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 kidnapping count and 1 count of forcible rape under California's one-strike rape law. The agreement came after prosecutors offered to drop some charges against Nancy in exchange for Philip pleading guilty to nearly the full indictment, with both giving up their right to appeal, a deal structured largely to avoid putting Jaycee and her daughters through courtroom testimony. Right after the pleas were entered, Jaycee issued a statement expressing relief that both Garridos had finally admitted to what they'd done to her and her family. The sentencing hearing took place on June 6, 2011, at the El Dorado County Superior Court in Placerville. Jaycee chose not to attend, explaining in a written statement that she refused to spend another moment of her life in their presence, that everything done to her was wrong, and that she hoped they'd eventually come to understand that. She wrote that she'd hated every moment of every day for 18 years, and that they had taken not just her life but her family's as well. Addressing Nancy Garrido specifically, she wrote that no version of a higher power could accept what Nancy had done, and expressed hope that both of them would suffer as many sleepless nights as she had. Her mother, Terry Probin, the same woman who had lost her daughter 18 years before, read Jaycee's statement aloud in court. Judge Douglas C. Kimister described Philip Garrido as emblematic of everything a sex offender represents, sentencing him to 431 years to life and Nancy Garrido to 36 years to life, the maximum available under the laws in place in 1991, when the crimes occurred. At 60 years old at sentencing, Philip Garrido would not be eligible for parole for decades, and his sentence guaranteed he would die in a California prison. Once sentencing concluded, the lingering question shifted away from the Garridos themselves and toward the system that had allowed this to continue for so long. Since Garrido had been a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape since 1976, meaning authorities were fully aware of who he was and what he was capable of, yet still failed to stop him. Over the following 18 years, numerous investigators visited Garrido's home to verify his parole compliance, yet none of them ever entered the concealed compound behind the house where Jaycee and her daughters were being held. When a neighbor reported suspicious activity to police in 2006, nothing substantial came of it, and a follow-up visit by investigators in 2008 still didn't include checking the compound. Jaycee later sued California over these systemic breakdowns, and the state settled for $20 million, the largest payout in its history over parole system failures, effectively acknowledging that what happened to her wasn't only a crime committed by the Garridos, but also a failure by the very system meant to prevent it. In the years following her rescue, Jaycee didn't just survive, she reportedly recovered to the point that her former therapist told the press she was doing remarkably well, someone visibly proud of what she'd built since leaving the Anch compound. In 2011, she published her memoir, A Stolen Life, detailing her 18 years in captivity. It became a bestseller and was widely praised as one of the most honest and courageous survivor accounts ever written, not for dwelling on graphic detail, but for accurately conveying the psychological reality of living through something only someone who experienced it could truly describe. She went on to found the Jaycee Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting abduction victims and their families, particularly in helping them reintegrate and heal from trauma that conventional medical and legal systems often aren't equipped to fully address. In doing so, she transformed the 18 years taken from her into something that could help others, a decision entirely her own to make, one nobody had the right to expect of her. The case offers 3 key lessons for anyone concerned with child safety and the justice system's effectiveness. The first involves the choice to release Garrido after just 11 years of a 50-year federal sentence for kidnapping and raping Catherine Hall in 1976, and the failure to heed her warning. When Hall alerted his parole agent that Garrido was continuing to exhibit dangerous behavior, the agent dismissed it in his notes, considering electronic monitoring too complicated given what he characterized as the victim's hysteria. 3 years later, Garrido kidnapped Jaycee. This points to a need for parole systems and courts to weigh sex offenders' reoffending risk far more seriously before release, and to treat victims' warnings as credible rather than dismissing them. The second lesson centers on the 60 parole visits over a decade in which no officer ever inspected the backyard, a failure that reflects a broader systemic flaw rather than any one person's mistake. Parole inspection protocols for offenders with histories of kidnapping and confining victims need to mandate full property searches, not just conversations at the front door. The $20 million settlement stands as an acknowledgement of that systemic failure, not compensation that can undo 18 years, but a formal admission that the system fell short in a preventable way. The third lesson highlights UC Berkeley officers Ally Jacobs and Lisa Campbell, who had no warrant, DNA evidence, or forensic tools to go on, only a gut sense that something was wrong when they observed Garrido with the 2 girls, and the willingness to act on that instinct rather than letting him walk away, as so many others had over the previous 18 years. The broader takeaway offered is that if something feels off, a frightened-looking child, an adult exerting excessive control over others, any situation that instinct flags as not right, it's worth reporting, without needing complete certainty, and letting authorities investigate from there. If you've watched this far, leave a comment. And let us know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.